Hello students, welcome to the Analyst dated 1st of November 2023. Today we'll look at 5 important articles from the Indian Express and the Hindu. The first article will be regarding the right to privacy. Then we'll look at the snooping. Then we'll understand what is normal monsoon and what are the deviations thereof. Then we'll look at the strategic force command, and lastly we'll understand what is windfall tax. Let's start with the first article, that is right to privacy. Now here the Solicitor General of India, he is arguing that the electoral bond scheme has been created to keep the donor's name anonymous, and this anonymity is to provide or to safeguard the right to privacy. The right to privacy, which became a fundamental right post the Puttaswamy judgment, which is also referred as the Aadhaar case. Now, right to privacy becomes important. Why? Because it is part of now Article 21. And whenever it is part of fundamental right, and it is something that is new to our jurisprudence, so this right to privacy is being used in multiple judgments thereof. So the same content will be relevant for any arguments of, let's say, surveillance, any arguments of, let's say, snooping, any arguments of privacy, any arguments of, let's say, marriage, any arguments of, let's say, going for transgender rights. Now, let's understand the backdrop. So, in 2012, a retired High Court judge, Justice K.S. Puttaswamy, he went on to challenge the Aadhaar, which was rolled out for a targeted delivery of services, more so for Manrega. Now, what was happening is that in lieu of Aadhaar, the biometric data plus the demographic data of our residents was being collected. So that was challenged. Now what happened is, in 2015, a 3-judge bench was looking at the arguments of privacy. So it was judging whether privacy is a fundamental right or not, and this is in lieu with the 2 prior judgments on privacy. One was MP Sharma versus Satish Chandra and Khadak Singh versus State of Uttar Pradesh. So these 2 judgments were to be seen whether they are relevant, whether they are correct in the current perspective, and whether we have a fundamental right called the right to privacy. Then it was elevated to a 5-judge bench and then finally to a 9-judge bench. Why? Because the strength of the current bench had to be higher than the bench that was there in these 2 cases. Now, what happened is that the outcome was that both of these judgments were overruled and privacy became a fundamental right under Article 21. Now, in this regard, we have to appreciate what is privacy. So, privacy is to be left alone, to not being watched, and the freedom or the autonomy to make choices or to take decisions without any interference. Now let's appreciate that in the Indian Constitution or in any other law, we do not have a particular definition of privacy. However, we must appreciate that Article 12 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it appreciates that there is a right to privacy, which is innate to any person being born. So this right comes the moment any person is born. Now, what all aspects will be covered under privacy? So let's say bodily integrity, then personal autonomy, then informational self-determination, protection from state surveillance, whether we are looking at, let's say, telephone tapping, or we are looking at, let's say, WhatsApp hacks, or we are looking at any illegal snooping. Then it is also about one's dignity. So the moment I am in the confines of my room, and if that is under surveillance, will it not amount to some kind of breach of my dignity? Yes. And we have appreciated that dignity once breached, one's life and liberty is affected, which is part of Article 21, part of fundamental right under Part 3. Therefore, it will have the consequences of Article 32 and 2 to 6. So we can go for a writ petition the moment our fundamental rights or Part 3 rights are violated. Then it is also about confidentiality. It is about not compelling someone to speak, or it is also about the freedom to dissent or to move or to think in a counter manner. Now, in terms of case law, what happened is that in MP Sharma, there was some search and seizure by the state. Now, the argument is that this was in breach of privacy. But the court ruled on the side of the state and it upheld the action of the state. That means going for search and seizure was a legitimate interest of the state under Article 12. The same happened with Khadak Singh, who was under continuous police surveillance. Why? Because he was a known criminal. Then the court again upheld that the right to privacy is not guaranteed as a fundamental right under the Constitution, and therefore police surveillance, that too legal police surveillance, is allowed and is a legitimate state interest. Now, in Govind versus State of MP, this is a 1975 case, the court came with the idea of compelling state interest. Now, this particular jurisprudence, this particular philosophy came from the US Constitution. That under compelling state interest, whenever the state has to protect its integrity, there has to be some issues of sovereignty. Whenever we are going for any kind of protection of state interest, whether it is about guarding the rights of other citizens, whether it is about protecting the citizens from, let's say, some terror activity, from some violent activities, or whether it is the challenge to the state when it comes to secessionism, extremism, terrorism. So these are considered the compelling state interest. So if any person is involved in these particular activities, then the fundamental right, or to say so, the right to privacy can be breached. Why? Because there is a clear state interest. Now, what happened in the telephone tapping case? This is nothing but the PUCL versus Union of India, and this is the case law of 1997. This is the phone tapping case. So it created a lot of political furor. Now here the court is seen to be changing its stance gradually. So here the court has held that individual had a privacy interest in the contents of their telephonic communication. And if the state is surveilling multiple people and their telephonic conversation, that it can be a breach of privacy. But the idea that privacy is a fundamental right was not dwelled into until the J. Puttaswamy judgment, where privacy suddenly became a fundamental right. And this must also be seen as a nature of Indian Constitution to organically change with the demands of the time. We must appreciate that this was also the time when phrases like data is the new oil had become more of a mainstream dialogues. Then the ideas of, let's say, big data, data analytics, talking about the Mang companies. So big tech, big data was in place at this point of time, and at this particular time the country was going through the Aadhaar revolution, which was changing the way the government interacts with its citizen, and it started involving the use of, let's say, direct benefit transfers to banking accounts. It also started doing, let's say, the linkage of multiple identities. Let's say your PAN card, your passport, let's say your bank accounts, and all of that with Aadhaar. So somehow what data was in silos was being integrated, and so there were arguments that were raised that this can lead to creation of an Orwellian state or a surveillance state where the state garners too much of power. Why? Because it has too much of data. And with this data on its own residents and its citizen, it can go for some coercive actions, thereby limiting the freedoms and therefore limiting the right to life and personal liberty. And we must appreciate that we have to, post Menka Gandhi case, we have to integrate our fundamental rights. They cannot be read in isolation. So if we are looking at the freedoms that are guaranteed in Article 19, and if we are looking at the arguments of equality under Article 14, and the trinity thereof completing 14, 19, 21, where in 21 we are looking at life and liberty. So all of them taking together, what was seeing is that state has now garnered too much of data, and therefore this was challenged. And to limit any coercive action, the right to privacy became part of the jurisprudence of India. Now, the judgment highlights some key arguments which we can use in different kind of answers and in any argument wherever we are dwelling into fundamental rights. So it held that life and personal liberty are inalienable rights. These are rights which are inseparable from a dignified human existence. And whenever we are saying about dignified human existence, we are essentially talking about Menka Gandhi versus Union of India, which held that life is not about mere animal existence. Then the dignity of individual and the quest for liberty. The quest for liberty, the quest for freedoms are the foundational pillars of Indian Constitution. That means even if the privacy was not directly, explicitly mentioned, but the arguments of privacy are already there in the Constitution. Then privacy at its core means preservation of personal intimacies. So can we disturb, let's say, two individuals who are, let's say, having a relationship and they are conducting their relationship in a private space? So Justice D.Y. Chandrachud famously said that the state has nothing to do with the confines of what happens between a couple in a room. Then the sanctity of family life, the sanctity of family life, the sanctity of marriage as an institution, the sanctity of family life as an institution cannot be breached. Why? It will be a violation of privacy. Then the idea of procreation, the idea of home, and the idea of sexual orientation is one's own decision, is one's own autonomy, and therefore part of privacy. So what we are seeing is that privacy was not simple, was not a singular right. Rather, it was a bundle of rights. Then privacy also connotes the right to be left alone, the right not to be disturbed, and simultaneously the right to be forgotten. That was read into privacy as what all dimensions of privacy are there. Then personal choices govern a way of life, and therefore the state should not have, unless there is a legitimate state interest, to dwell into what is a way of life of an individual, and that too in a private space. Then privacy attaches the person since it is an essential facet of dignity of human being. And similarly, let's say there is an individual and that individual has a mobile device. So that mobile device is nothing but the reflection or the extension of one's personality. So if I am going for a seizure of the mobile phone, I very well be having a legitimate state interest, else it can become a violation of my privacy rights and therefore a violation of my fundamental rights under Article 21. Then naturally, like any right, it is not absolute. That means there are reasonable restrictions. The way we saw that Article 19(1)(a) gives us multiple freedoms, but 19(2) suddenly gives us the reasonable restrictions. So, like any other fundamental right, these rights are also not absolute. Then there are positive and negative rights. That means when we are talking about privacy, it is giving the state the duty to protect one's privacy. Simultaneously, it also reposes some limitations on the state, that state should not intervene or should not get into someone's private affairs. So both positive and negative right. Then it protects the inner sphere of an individual from interference, whether from state and non-state actor. That means today, if there is an intermediary, let's say there is Meta, or there is, let's say, X, and they are interfering today with one's inner core, that is your private affairs, then they are also liable. Why? Because they become non-state actors. So state as well as non-state actors, that is a wider. So gradually what we are seeing, that the funnel of privacy has enlarged multiple rights rather than becoming a single right. Then the privacy of the home, family, marriage, procreation, sexual orientation, which are all important aspects of dignity. So what we are seeing is that life, liberty, dignity, all of these are now getting linked with privacy. So now to have a wholesome life, to have a meaningful life, in the words of Menaka Gandhi, we must also have the right to privacy. Let's look at the second article, which is regarding snooping. Now what has happened is that several politicians who were using the Apple device, they received an alert from the tech giant that the devices were being targeted by state-sponsored attackers for breach. They were trying for breach of their mobile phones. Now this pertains to internal security, and this also pertains to our Indian Constitution. Now let's look at what is snooping. So if I am very carefully, let's say, going for recce, or I am carefully observing without the other person knowing, an observation in terms of, let's say, physical observation, let's say digital observation, let's say on social media, let's say in terms of finances. So if I am doing all of this, I am doing nothing but snooping. I am involved in something called as surveillance. Now, legally, it is surveillance of all actions, locations, friends, etc. Why? Because I have some legitimate interest. And what is that legitimate interest? So today what we are seeing is that state all over the world is going for such surveillance or snooping to prevent, let's say, some crimes. But what we are also witnessing is that there is a rise in terms of big tech. Big tech going for surveillance, for preemptive actions. Why? Because at the time, let's say, there is a riot, and this riot has been created due to some messaging, some forwards. Then after the riot, what was happening is that big tech was held to be responsible, that it was not able to curtail the spread of the messages. Now, whenever we are talking about big tech, we are essentially talking about intermediaries. Now, these intermediaries, they have immunity. So, which is called the safe harbor provisions under the IT Act, where, let's say, I am messaging, let's say I am giving some riot-like messages, or I am inciting some violence. So, Meta will not be responsible for my messages on which were transmitted through Meta apps, right? I will be responsible. So Meta has got the legal immunity, or to say so, safe harbor. But again, it will be dragged into muddle, it will be dragged into negative news. So what is happening is that today surveillance or snooping is being done not only by state but also non-state actors like big tech. And if big tech is snooping, there is lack of privacy laws, data protection laws, not only in India but all across the world. While simultaneously what we are looking at, that countries like, let's say, countries which are in Europe, countries like Germany, they are going for massive fines on these big tech companies. Why? Because they are found to be, they are, after investigation, they are found to be involved in two typical type of practices. One is anti competitive practices, that means killing your own competition, and secondly is privacy breaches, or to say so, going for illegal surveillance. Why? Because it was found out that after all the codes are made by some people and the codes are therefore human centric. So whenever there is some element of human judgment involved, no code can clearly point out what is a offensive message or what is not. Then what was happening is that a pattern was coming out that some particular politicians were being targeted by these big tech companies. Now we must appreciate that what is the legitimate reason that all these state actors, we are not talking about non-state actor, what the state actors give for snooping and what are the legal means for going for snooping or surveillance. So it can be your money laundering, it can be your, let's say, terrorism, it can be, let's say, left-wing extremism, it can be, let's say, insurgency in the northeast, it can be about organized crime, it can be about drug syndicate, it can be about the linkages of organized crime with, let's say, terrorism or extremist activities. It can also be about spread of fake news. It can also be about forwards which are done to incite violence and to create riots, like what happened in Delhi. So to preempt, to take preemptive action, the state would take all the decisions in its power to look at the probable crimes that can happen. So that is a legitimate state interest to prevent money laundering, to prevent fake currency, to prevent such syndicates, such organized crimes. And therefore the state has got the power legally to go for snooping. So under the IT Act of 2000, Rule 4 of IT Rules 2009, it gives power to 10 central agencies to snoop. What are these? The Intelligence Bureau, the NCB, which looks into drugs, Enforcement Directorate, which is looking into money laundering, then CBDT, evasion of taxes, Directorate of Revenue Intelligence, again smuggling, evasion of taxes, CBI specialized crimes, then NIA looks into terrorism, Research and Analysis Wing, that is the Cabinet Secretariat. It is involved in countering India's adversaries at a global level. That means outside Indian territory. Then you have DSI, then you have Commissioner of Police Delhi. So these 10 central agencies, they have got the power of snooping. But how do they go for snooping? So either the permission has to come from the secretary, from the Home Secretary, that is the Secretary in Ministry of Home Affairs at the national level, or it has to be Secretary who is the head of Home Department, that is the Ministry of Home at the state level. And if that is not, if this is not happening, then in emergency conditions, what we can do is that it can be issued by a joint secretary, no officer which is lesser than the position of joint secretary in an emergent situations. Now, what are the acts that are also being used? So, an archaic act, that is the Telegraph Act, and its section 5(2) is being used. And what are the arguments? The arguments is sovereignty and integrity of the state, friendly relations with other countries, then public order, public tranquility, when we are talking about law and order, to prevent any violence, to prevent any riots. Now all these laws are multiple times being used, and at times what we have found is that this snooping at times is being used to target, let's say, some particular individuals, let's say media. then these cases have only went, or let's say when we are targeting the opponent politicians, then these cases itself have gone to the Supreme Court. And the famous case was PUCL versus Union of India of 1997. Now, what is the criticism? That snooping lacks any oversight. And when we are talking about oversight, what kind of decision is this? It is executive decision. Then such executive decision is also taken in secrecy. So, is there any audit, even if it is an audit which becomes a part of post-mortem? So, any audit by, let's say, the judiciary or let's say the legislature, whether or not a particular snooping action, a snooping order was legal or not, whether it was needed or not, then the surveillance it targets or the intermediary has no right to be heard. So let's say this person is being targeted on, let's say, Meta. So both of them will rarely know that the platform is used to look at this person. So they do not have a right to be heard. Now, an argument is that this is against the principles of natural justice. Then no independent accountability mechanism. Let's say someone does something wrong. So what will be the punishment? That is not clearly laid out. And therefore more of opacity and lack of transparency. Now, how does it impact? It directly impacts my rights under Article 19, under Article 14. So I am treating two residents unequally. I am treating two citizens unequally. I am illegally snooping on someone while I am not restricting any freedoms of other. Then I am restricting the right to, let's say, speech, movement, occupation, etc. Then the right to privacy under Article 21. Your dignity, your life, liberty, all is affected. And therefore, let's say the state is going for surveillance on any person. So state is going for surveillance on any person P. So this P does not know. The intermediary also doesn't know. So that means if they would have known this, then they would approach, let's say, the court, claiming that their rights have been violated under Article 32 or Article 226. If they do not know, they do not have information, they have partial information or they have no information. So their rights to information is also breached and their fundamental rights are also breached. So what they can do? What legitimate solution they will have? So they are both kept in abeyance and therefore their violation of Article 32 and 226 rights are also there. Then it hampers the free exchange of information and it creates a distrust between the state and the citizen. So this communication must be a two-way. It must be a two-way communication. Now, if I'm going for surveillance, what it does is it increases the power distance between state and citizen. So it becomes an issue of governance also. It becomes an issue of lack of trust also on the ordinary citizens. Therefore, the Prime Minister always says that trust must be reposed on the ordinary citizens of India, that they are giving their taxes, they are filing their taxes duly. Now, what are the case laws? So again, the case laws which were used when we are talking about privacy, they again become relevant. Why? Because the idea of privacy only started in the courts with these surveillance cases. So Khadak Singh versus State of Uttar Pradesh, PUCL versus Union of India. PUCL was the only case where the Supreme Court said that if you are tapping telephones, it can very well breach someone's privacy. Why? Because the communication was between two people and it was meant to be for two people and it is not to be breached. Now, what the Puttaswamy judgment says, that telephone tapping and internet hacking by the state of personal data is another area that falls within the realm of privacy. So it did not clearly say that surveillance is illegal or surveillance is legal, but it laid down, it used the test of proportionality. And so every state action, whether it is correct or not, will be judged on the parameters of test of proportionality, which says that there must be a legitimate state goal. There must be a clear goal, what I want to achieve. And there must be a nexus with what I am doing. So let's say I am snooping someone, but what was my goal? And there must be a nexus between the two. So a rational connection or nexus must be there, and there must be no better alternative. Why can't I directly ask my citizen whether they are involved in some illegal nefarious activities? So is there no other better alternative? If there is no better alternative, that means my snooping or my surveillance becomes necessary. And most importantly, my actions must be proportionate to the crimes that are committed by the alleged crimes that are committed by the other person. Now, this year's monsoon has been called a normal monsoon. But as ordinary citizens, what we have seen is there were too many variations. And these variations we have covered multiple times through various topics. These topics are, let's say, the incessant rains in Himalayas or Himachal Pradesh. Then we were looking at the triple dip La Nina, followed by this year's El Nino, which was to be balanced by a positive Indian Ocean dipole. Then did we also see that there were drought-like conditions in regions like Marathwada, while there were flood-like conditions in Himachal Pradesh. Then we were also looking at that there are changing patterns in terms of rainfall. The rainfall spread, the rainfall breaks, the rainfall burst, it is all changing. Now all of that has been attributed to something called as climate change. But let's look at what is this normal monsoon telling us and how the future can be and how it relates to our Indian agriculture, how it becomes a very crucial factor of not only Indian agriculture but also the Indian economy, which is largely agrarian. So what we have seen is that this is the 8th consecutive year of normal monsoon with 94% of overall rainfall. So the variation is only 6%. Then there are spatial and temporal variations. Whenever we are talking about spatial variation, what we are saying is that in space, let's say this is a space. Some areas are receiving too much of rainfall. Some areas are getting sparse rainfall or less rainfall. So here what we are looking at is flooding, and the case in example is Himachal Pradesh, devastation all along the Beas. And simultaneously we were looking at drought-like conditions, let's say in the Marathwada region. Then we were also looking at that August had a dry spell. September again had a dry spell. So what was happening actually is that the overall rainfall is good. The overall rain is 94%. But what we are looking at? We are looking at that there are extreme climate events. And these extreme climate events can be seen how? By, let's say, looking at northeast, by looking at different regions, let's say Himalayas, by looking at different regions, let's say northwest of India, then the plateau interiors. Now the data shows us that the heavy rainfall events, they are again increasing, and then there are extreme heavy rainfall events. They have suddenly increased. So 421 extreme events of rainfall, and this is particularly in reference with the Himalayan region, more so the northwestern Himalayas. On the other hand, what we are seeing is that the seasonal rainfall, it is more so fluctuating over the years. But the catch lies when we look at different regions. Let's say this is India and we are looking at, let's say, northeast. So northeast over the period of time, according to IMD, it is looking at a decreasing trend. Decrease in overall southwest monsoon. And we must appreciate that these are the regions where we have places like Meghalaya. And places like Cherrapunji, Tura, Minsaram, they will have more than 1200 centimeters of rain. Now we must also appreciate that the northeast has undulating topography. And due to this undulating topography, if rain is decreasing, naturally the rain saved is very low because of the slope. So these areas are facing, multiple areas in the northeast are now facing water stress like conditions. Why? Because let's say earlier the monsoon was having a peak in a year. Now what is happening? That at the same time the peak is same, but the duration of that peak has decreased. That means the rain might have increased, but it is only available in 1 month. And then it is followed by a large dry spell. When we are looking at northwest, we are looking at flooding in regions like Jodhpur. So cities which were not having the capacity to handle such rain are now facing issues of, let's say, flash floods. Why? Because in India, what we are seeing is that here there is positive increase in rainfall. Similarly, if we go towards Myanmar, what is happening that the rain is decreasing. On the other hand, if we see towards west of, let's say, Rajasthan, towards Pakistan, what is happening that in recent years, Pakistan also faced multiple flood-like conditions during the southwest monsoon. Now, what happened in the Himalayas? In the Himalayas, there were incessant rains. And due to this incessant rains, what we saw was the Sikkim cascading disaster. Then the incessant rainfall in Himachal Pradesh, which snapped multiple infrastructure pipelines. Then, if we look at peninsular India, the regions which are in interior, they are under extreme water stress. Why? Because the dry spells, they have increased. Then there is sudden breaks in monsoon, and these number of breaks, they have also increased. Then there is delay in burst also. And some of the wettest regions in India, that is Kerala, Meghalaya, they are receiving lesser rainfall. So that means overall, whenever we are saying that there is normal monsoon, it does not mean we actually have a normal monsoon. That simply means that the overall condition might be same, but in some space there might be variations. And when we look at time, then what we can say that, let's say, a particular state is receiving rainfall in, let's say, June or in July. So that the expected rain was in July, but they are getting their rain in, let's say, August. So what we are seeing is that there is extreme variation. And today, all of this is attributed to the climate change. But again, we must appreciate that monsoon in itself is a complex phenomena, which apart from climate change, it is also dependent on how the cyclones progress, how the western disturbance progress, how the subtropical westerly jet stream, they move, what happens to the low pressure system that is built over India. So this complex dynamics coupled with El Nino and what happens in the Indian Ocean region in terms of Madden-Julian oscillations and Indian Ocean dipole, this complex phenomena coupled with climate change, it has created these variations in what we today call a normal monsoon, and therefore it can have very diverse effects when we are looking at our cropping patterns, which can directly affect. So if we have such variations, it will affect agriculture. Agriculture will naturally affect the incomes, and if there is income variation, then it will affect the corporate earnings. And if there is income shortage or there is some income fluctuation, it will lead to agrarian distress, possible suicides. And if agriculture is affected, the rural economy is affected. If agriculture is affected, it will affect the inflation cycle. And if it is affecting the inflation cycle, it can affect the repo rates. All of that tells us that decision making for corporations, decision making for state governments, decision making for the central government, and all the agencies, state, non-state actors who are participant of this Indian economy, including the retail people, they are having variations in their demand and supply also because of the variation that we are seeing in a normal monsoon. Let's look at the Strategic Force Command, and this pertains to GS3 internal security. Now the president has terminated service of a major with the Strategic Forces Unit for security breach. Now we must understand that the Strategic Force Command is part of the Nuclear Command Authority. Now this Strategic Force Command is handling all the nuclear assets, and it is also responsible for delivery of these nuclear assets, whether it is strategic weapons or there are tactical weapons. Then the NCA, the Nuclear Command Authority, it has a political wing and it has a security wing. The political wing is being headed. The decision in the political wing will be taken after there is a clearance from the security panel, which is headed by the National Security Advisor. And the political decision will be taken by the executive, that is the cabinet, which is headed by the Prime Minister. So the National Command Authority is having the strategic command force, and this national NCA will take the decision to, let's say, go for some deployment of nuclear assets. Once it takes the decision to deploy the nuclear assets, then the Strategic Force Command will deliver all the necessary. Let's look at the Strategic Force Command, and this pertains to your GS3, where the president has terminated the services of a major with Strategic Forces Unit for security breach. Now the Strategic Forces Command is responsible for handling India's nuclear assets, whether they are strategic or they are tactical. Then it comes under the Nuclear Command Authority or the NCA. So it works like the NCA has two wings, the political wing and the security wing. The security wing is headed by the National Security Advisor. Now, if the National Security Advisor advises for deployment of nuclear weapons, then the final decision lies with the political bosses, that is the Prime Minister. That is the cabinet headed by the Prime Minister. Once the decision is being okayed by the NCA will ask the Strategic Forces Command to deploy these assets, and therefore the final action will be taken by the Strategic Forces Command, but the decision making is not with the Strategic Forces Command. And it is a tri-services organization which is run by a commander-in-chief who is a 3-starred general. Let's look at windfall tax. Center hikes windfall tax on crude, cuts levy on diesel exports. This pertains to our GS3 economy. Now, why do we deploy a windfall tax? Why a windfall tax is applied on a particular sector? Because let's say some petro giants, they were planning for some R&D to get a particular profit in a particular area. But what happens due to geopolitical circumstances? Due to some circumstances which were not planned, the petro sector is having some profit in some other area. Let's say because of some conducive conditions of crude oil imports from Russia, which were not planned and which happened because of Russia-Ukraine war. So if the petro giants, they are getting profits from a sector which they did not plan for, and in not a sector which they were planning for, they were planning for their profits in a particular business division, but they got the profits because of some newer global issues or some issues which they are not control of, and they are getting some excessive profit. Then the government finds a legitimate reason to tax this excess profit and then to redistribute this. Redistribute to people. Why? Because people are finally facing the burn of, let's say, higher prices of oil. Now, when it is imposed, is that there is sudden increase in an industry's revenue and it cannot be linked to anything the company actively pursued as a business decision. Then there is sharp increase in revenue due to unrelated external events, and case in example is, let's say, the Russia-Ukraine war, or let's say the Israel-Palestine conflict. Now, the rationale remains that it is about redistribution of these unexpected gains, and high price benefits producers at the expense of finally consumers. And therefore, it must be passed to the state, which the state can thereof use for the benefit of people and for redistribution. And it also narrows the country's widening deficit, and it acts as a supplementary revenue stream at times of crisis whenever this crisis is global in nature. Thank you so much. I hope it helped.